The holding bay smelled like fear and old metal and the chemical sweetness of combine synthesis slabs, and Aishe carried the first tray through the door without saying a word. 47 people, some sitting, some standing, some pressed against the far bulkhead in clusters that told her things before she was close enough to see faces. The clusters were the language she read first, who had been taken together, who had found each other on the collection vessel, who was alone. The alone ones were the ones she would reach first, but the food went to everyone at the same pace, because the food was a statement. The first thing she gave them was food. Food demonstrated intent without requiring a shared language. The Combine had given them food too, but the Combine's food was the suppression slab designed to do something to them. The food she gave them was the kind the crew had fought for. Dika's recalibrated synthesis, output set to 105% of baseline, the dormant parameters unlocked and tuned until the result was dense and warm and tasted like something a body recognized. This distinction was communicable in taste, not words. She moved through the bay with the tray held in front of her at chest height, both hands visible, the way she had learned to approach in the first days aboard the Arvith, when everything had been improvised and desperate, and she hadn't had a protocol yet. Now she had a protocol. It had taken 60 days to build it, and it started here. Food offered without conditions, distributed in a pattern that moved from the edges of the room inward, from the most isolated to the most clustered, so that the ones who were most frightened saw the ones who were less frightened accept the food first. A man near the port bulkhead, human, his clothing suggesting somewhere in the Mediterranean, century uncertain, but the weave of his tunic placed him before the fall of Rome, or well after its memory had scattered, flinched when she approached. She stopped, set the tray down on the deck, took one of the portions herself, bit into it, chewed, swallowed. Then she nudged the tray toward him with her foot and moved on. He took it. They almost always took it. The non-humans were harder to read, but far from impossible. Two species she hadn't encountered before. One group of 5 with elongated torsos and skin that shifted color in slow tidal waves, currently all cycling through a deep bruised blue that Aishe catalogued as distress or cold or both. Another pair, compact and dense-bodied, with facial structures that reminded her of the carved stone guardians she'd seen once in a church in Wallachia. Heavy brows, deep-set eyes that caught light like polished obsidian. They watched her approach with the stillness of creatures who had learned that movement attracted attention, and attention attracted pain. She offered the food with the same gesture, open hands, no words. The tidal skin group reached for it together, all 5 moving in a coordinated wave that told her they communicated through more than sound. The stone-faced pair waited until she had stepped back 3 paces before one of them, the smaller, took a portion and sniffed it, then touched it to the inside of their wrist. Testing. Good. Testing meant they were thinking, and thinking meant they hadn't been broken yet. Bityarin, a single one, alone, the only one of their kind on the collection vessel's route, had positioned itself in the exact center of the bay. Its triple-jointed legs were folded beneath it in a posture Aishe recognized from the outpost Iran, alert, passive, processing. Its segmented eyes tracked her with a slow kaleidoscopic rotation that meant it was reading her on all 3 channels. She set a portion beside it without stopping. It would eat when it was ready. The outpost Ikran had already noticed it. She could feel that through the way the eldest had shifted position near the bay entrance, angling its body toward the newcomer, just present. 47 portions distributed, 3 minutes per circuit, 4 circuits to cover the bay, 12 minutes of silence in which the only sounds were the hum of the Arveth's environmental systems, the sounds of consumption, and the hush that fell over a room full of people who did not yet know whether to be relieved or more afraid. Aishe collected the empty tray and stood at the bay entrance and gave them 20 minutes to eat. Medical triage was the second layer. She moved through the 47 again, this time with purpose and proximity, reading bodies the way she had been reading bodies since before the Combine had ever touched her life. On the roads of Central Europe, In the camps and caravans, you learned to see who was sick before they told you, because people who were running rarely stopped to describe their symptoms. You read gait, skin color, the way a hand trembled or didn't, the rhythm of breathing. The Combine's collection process added its own signatures. The suppression slabs left a metabolic residue, a dragging quality, as if the body had been running at 80% for so long it had forgotten what full capacity felt like. Deca had explained the mechanism. The slabs suppressed resistance by 31% through deliberate caloric insufficiency. The body adapted, the mind adapted. The will to fight drained away through careful, calibrated inadequacy. 4 people were in acute distress, 3 humans and 1 of the tidal skin group. The first human was a woman whose clothing said nothing Aishe could place, undyed linen, a cut that could have been 100 eras, bare feet with calluses that spoke of a life spent walking on stone. She was curled on her side, her breathing shallow and rapid, her skin hot to the touch, transition shock compounding the slab effect. Aishe knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder, firm, because gentle could be mistaken for tentative, and tentative could be mistaken for uncertainty. The woman opened her eyes, dark, unfocused. Aishe said nothing. She produced a water vessel Deca had calibrated, clean synthesis water with the mineral profile adjusted to match human baseline, and held it where the woman could see it. Waited, the woman reached for it. Drank. Aishe watched the rhythm of her swallowing. Steady, controlled, dehydration, not organ distress, recoverable. The second was a man who had clearly been taken mid-combat. His arms bore defensive wounds that the Combine's containment process had sealed with the molecular adhesive they used as a field dressing. The adhesive was efficient. It was also, Aishe had learned, mildly toxic to human tissue over periods longer than a few hours, producing a slow inflammatory reaction that looked like infection but wasn't. She peeled the adhesive strips carefully, cleaned the wounds with synthesis water, and applied the cloth compression wraps she'd learned to make from the Arveth's textile synthesizer. It watched her work with the focused attention of someone who understood wound care. Military, probably. The era didn't matter. The body's need to be tended was older than any army. The third human was a child, perhaps 8, perhaps 10, impossible to age precisely through the film of exhaustion and fear. Younger than Cal, sitting very still in a corner with the practiced stillness of a child who had learned that being small and invisible was a survival strategy. Aishe didn't approach directly. She sat down 4 paces away, took out a portion of the recalibrated food, and ate it herself. Slowly, making the act of eating look safe. After several minutes, the child looked at her. After several more, the child moved closer. Aishe did not reach out. The child would come when the child was ready, and the child came when the child was ready, and Aishe gave them food and water, and did not ask a single question, because a child who had learned to be that still had been asked questions by people whose questions were not kind, and Aishe would not be one of those people. The tidal skin individual in distress was harder to read. Its color cycling had shifted from the bruised blue to a rapid oscillation between blue and a pale, washed-out gray that the other 4 members of its group were reacting to. They pressed close, their own color patterns sinking into a harmonic. Communication, care. Aishe observed for 5 full minutes before intervening. The individual's breathing, if the rhythmic expansion and contraction of its torso was breathing, was a rhythmic stuttering. She couldn't treat what she didn't understand, but she could remove obstacles. She checked the individual's wrists and ankles for combined restraint residue. Found it, the molecular adhesive again, applied around both wrists in thick bands that had tightened as the individual's tissue had swollen in reaction. She removed them. The color cycling slowed within minutes. The group pressed closer, their harmonics deepening. This was the part of the work that mattered most, and was hardest to explain to anyone who hadn't done it. It was removing. The combine had applied restraints and suppressants and inadequate nutrition and the cold efficiency of processing, and the job was to take away what had been imposed. The body knew how to recover. The mind knew how to recover. You just had to stop the machine from interfering. 20 minutes of observation before attempting communication with a new species. This was the rule she had set for herself after the first days with the Ikrin, when she had learned that rushing to build a bridge before she understood the terrain on the other side produced bridges that collapsed under weight. 20 minutes of watching. What channels do they use? What is the relationship between sound and gesture and proximity? What do they do when they are at ease versus when they are alarmed? What is the smallest unit of social interaction? The pair, the group, the individual? The tidal skin group communicated primarily through color. She had seen this in the holding bay. Their interactions were almost entirely chromatic, with slow waves of color passing between individuals in patterns that repeated and varied. Sound was secondary. They produced a low-frequency vibration that Aishe felt in her sternum more than heard in her ears, and the vibration seemed to modulate the color communication the way tone modulated speech. She cataloged what she could: the deep blue of distress, the harmonized pattern of care, a brighter teal that appeared when they noticed her watching, and that she tentatively coded as attention or acknowledgement. She began with a simple color-adjacent strategy. She had, over 60 days aboard the Arvith, accumulated a collection of synthesized fabric strips in different colors, originally for wound care, now repurposed into communication tools. She selected 5 strips, blue, teal, warm amber, white, and a deep red, laid them on the deck between herself and the group, touched the blue, pointed to the distressed individual, touched the teal, pointed to herself. All 5 of them shifted to a pale version of the amber. She didn't know what that meant yet, but they were responding, and their response was coordinated, and coordinated response meant social species with a communication system complex enough to build a bridge to. The stone-faced pair were different. Their communication was structural. They positioned their bodies relative to each other and to the environment in configurations that carried meaning. Aishe recognized the architecture because it rhymed with something she knew. The way her own people arranged the camp, where the fire was, who sat where, what the spatial relationships said about hierarchy and trust and readiness to move. These two communicated through where they were. She approached them by choosing a position not directly facing that was confrontational in almost every social species she had encountered. She sat at an angle, roughly 45 degrees off the line between them, equidistant from both. The smaller one shifted minutely. The larger one didn't move, but its deep-set eyes tracked her with an intensity that felt like being read. She waited. After 11 minutes, she counted heartbeats, her own, 68 per minute, a habit she developed when she had no other clock. The smaller one moved. It shifted its body to mirror her angle, creating a triangular configuration. 3 points, equidistant. Aishe smiled. Not for them, they might not read it. For herself, because she recognized what they'd done, they'd answered her geometry with geometry. She began with the combined vocabulary she carried, the 90-odd terms she'd built with the Ikrin, the broader corpus Dika had helped her index. These were the words everyone in the combined system encountered, the operational language of captivity. She spoke them quietly, testing which ones produced recognition. Food. The smaller one's head tilted. Water. Both shifted. Holding. Both went completely still. That last one hurt. The word holding, the combined term for containment, produced a physical flinch in beings whose communication system was built on spatial relationships. Of course it did. The Kambi Day had put spatial beings in a box. Aishe became aware of her in stages. First, a presence in the peripheral field during the food distribution, someone moving with the tray's logic, not against it, someone who had observed the pattern, edges to center, isolated to clustered, and had begun replicating it on the far side of the bay without being asked. Second, a reorganization of the sleeping arrangements. The 47 had been sprawled in the holding bay in the pattern they'd arrived in. the pattern the collection vessel had imposed. Sometime in the first 4 hours, someone had adjusted that pattern, moved the child closer to the Mediterranean woman, shifted the stone-faced pair to a location with sight lines to both exits, positioned the tidal skin group near the environmental vent where the air was warmest, created a circuit path, a clear walking lane, that followed the route Aishe had been using for medical checks. Third, Aishe completed a triage circuit and found a stack of cloth strips waiting at her next station, pre-cut to the width she used for wound compression, arranged in order of length. She stopped. She looked up and found the woman, human, East Asian features, hair pulled back in a practical knot, clothing that had been austere even before the combine had replaced it with a standard issue coverall. Her hands were folded in front of her, not clasped, folded, the way someone accustomed to administrative precision held their hands when they were not writing. She stood at the junction between the tidal skin group and the stone-faced pair, positioned so that both groups could see her, but neither was crowded. She had been on the collection vessel's cargo manifest, 3 months in the combine system, and in those 3 months she had done something that Aishe recognized with a clarity that went deeper than language. She had mapped the machine from inside it. Aishe could see it in the way the woman moved through the bay, with the contained efficiency of someone who had already built a model of the system and was now optimizing within it. She had identified the food distribution pattern. She had identified the medical circuit. She had identified the spatial needs of each group and adjusted the base configuration to serve those needs. She had not asked permission. She had identified problems and solved them. Aishe walked over to her. The woman watched her approach without tension, her posture, a professional readiness that Aishe associated with people who worked in courts or administrative centers, people whose job required them to be constantly aware of who was coming, who was going, and what needed doing next. They had no shared language. Aishe knew this before she opened her mouth. The woman's era and origin were written in the structure of her face and the set of her body and the way she held her folded hands, and none of those things overlapped with any of the languages Aishe carried. They had the Cambian vocabulary, the freight manifest words of captivity. Aishe said, in the Cambian's operational tongue, the words flat and precise, "You are helping." That woman's eyes met hers. No surprise, no deference, the steady gaze of someone who had been waiting to be noticed because she understood that integration required acknowledgement. Yes, the woman said, the same tongue, the same flat precision, one word, and it was a confirmation of an observed fact. She was helping. Of course she was helping. Good, Aishe said. She stood there for a moment, looking at this woman, and felt an emotion she had no word for in any of her languages, the recognition of a type. Every era produced them, every culture, every crisis, the ones who responded to disorder by organizing, who walked into a system they didn't fully understand and began mapping it because the alternative was to sit in the dark and wait. She had done exactly what Aishe would have done. Mapped the machine from inside it, identified the mechanism of control, built a model of the organization without having the full vocabulary for any of it. She had been in the combine for 3 months, and she was already doing what it had taken Aishe 40 days to learn. Aishe was glad they had gotten her out of that vessel. Over the next 6 hours, built from combine vocabulary and demonstration, and the careful inference that came from watching how someone solved problems, Aishe learned what the woman knew, the suppression slabs. The woman had identified the metabolic effect, not the mechanism. She didn't have the vocabulary for biochemistry, but the pattern. She had noticed that the people who ate more of the combine food became quieter, less resistant, more compliant. She had noticed that the effect was proportional. More consumption, more suppression. She had noticed that it was reversible. People who refused the food for a day or two became more alert, more restive, more difficult for the guards to manage. She had noticed all of this in 3 months. Aishe was very quiet for a moment after learning this. The information itself wasn't new. Dika had mapped the suppression mechanism weeks ago, but the woman had done it alone, in a box, without instruments, without allies, without anyone to tell. She had built the model and carried it in her head and waited. 3 months. The Combine took people and put them in boxes and fed them food that made them compliant, and the woman had looked at the box and the food and the compliance and had seen the system and had begun to understand it and had done all of this without anyone asking her to, without any reason to believe she would ever be in a position to use the knowledge, without hope as a prerequisite. Because that was what this kind of person did. They mapped, they organized, they prepared, not because they expected rescue, because the alternative was to stop being themselves. Choice was the thing Aishe gave them last, because choice required the other 3 first. You could not choose anything meaningful when you were hungry. You could not choose when you were in acute physical distress. You could not choose something you had no language to describe. Choice came last, but it came day 2, the holding bay had transformed. The spatial reorganization the woman had begun on the first day had continued, refined by input from the groups themselves as they settled and began to assert their own preferences. The tidal skin group had claimed the warmest section and arranged themselves in a pentagon configuration that Aishe suspected was a resting formation. The stone-faced pair had established a position near the port bulkhead with clear sight lines, exactly where Aishe would have put sentries, which told her something about what they had been before the Combine. The lone Ikran had been integrated into the periphery of the eldest's attention, not absorbed, just held in a field of awareness that said, "You are not alone anymore." The child had attached itself to the Mediterranean woman, who had recovered enough to sit up and eat, and had responded to the child's proximity with the automatic protective instinct that needed no shared language or era or culture to operate. Aishe stood at the center of the bay and addressed the 47. She used every bridge she had, the Combine operational vocabulary, spoken slowly and clearly, the gesture language she had developed with the Ikran, translated through the eldest's presence, the color strips for the tidal skin group, arranged in a sequence she had spent the last day calibrating, attention, hear, listen, choice. A 9-facial positioning for the stone-faced pair, placing herself at the apex of a triangle that she hoped communicated speaker, not commander. And for the humans, the fragments of Latin and the handful of Norse words she had absorbed from Sahel and the Nahuatl ceremonial terms Taigo had taught her, and the Combine pidgin that was nobody's language and therefore everybody's. He told them what the Arvith was, a stolen ship, stolen from the people who had taken them, crewed by people who had been cargo and had stopped being cargo. She told them what the Arvith was doing, finding other cargo, getting them out. She did not use the word rescue because rescue implied a hierarchy she did not want to establish, rescuer above rescued. She used the Combine word for transfer and modified it with a gesture that meant your direction, pointing outward. She told them where the Arvith was going, toward a Combine holding station, toward 14 more people in boxes, and then she told them they could choose. The Arvith was one option, stay, join. The consent-based manifest Deka had built would carry their names, the names they chose, not the designations the Combine had assigned. They would be crew or they would be passengers, but they would not be cargo. The frontier outpost was another option, the waypoint where salespeople maintained a place for those who had been freed and needed somewhere to stop. Aishe described it in the only terms she had, a place that was safe, where the Combine did not go, where people from many species lived without the machine. The Combine was a third option. If they wanted to go back, if their reasons took them there, she would not ask why, and she would not argue. She said this last part very carefully, and she meant every word of it, and the effort of meaning it was the hardest part of the protocol. The room was quiet for a long time. Responses came in waves. The tidal skin group shifted to a warm amber, the color Aishe had tentatively coded as acknowledgement, and held it, all 5, together, staying. The stone-faced pair exchanged a long look, a spatial communication, their bodies adjusting relative to each other and to the bay in minute increments that Aishe read as assessment, agreement, decision. Staying, the lone Ifran didn't even hesitate. Its segmented eyes rotated toward the eldest, and whatever passed between them on the third channel was enough. It was already home. The humans sorted themselves with the mixture of hope and caution and grief that Aishe recognized from every crossroads she had ever stood at in a life full of crossroads. Most stayed. The man with the defensive wounds, military, she'd been right, stood up and looked at her and said a word in a language she didn't know, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Yes, the Mediterranean woman stayed, and the child stayed with her, and Aishe did not think about the child too hard, because thinking about the child meant thinking about what the Combine had done to a child, and that was a door she would open later, in private, where no one could see. Three of the Tidal Skin group. No, not Tidal Skin. She needed to stop using that descriptor. She would learn their name. 3 members of a species she hadn't cataloged yet came to her through a communication chain that involved one of the stone-faced pair acting as a spatial intermediary, and Aishe working the color strips and the combined vocabulary simultaneously. And through this improbable bridge she understood they had a destination. A place, not the outpost, not the Arveth's heading, somewhere else, coordinates they could not express in the Combine's navigational system, but which they described in terms of relative position and stellar landmarks that Aishe transcribed as carefully as she could. She relayed the coordinates to Veth through the Keeper communication channel the Arveth's Commas array accepted. She did not know if Veth could act on them. She did not know if the coordinates were reachable. She sent them anyway because the protocol was choice, and choice meant the possibility of outcomes she could not control. 3 others, humans, from an era Aishe couldn't place, who had been quiet throughout and had eaten the food and accepted the medical care and listened to the choice and then looked at each other with the expression of people who had already decided, asked to go back to a combined holding station, not the one they'd been taken from, a different one. They had a reason, and the reason lived in the glances they exchanged, and Aishe did not ask and would not ask because the protocol said choice without interrogation, and she had built the protocol, and she would follow it. She relayed those coordinates too, 41 staying, 3 departing for an unknown destination, 3 returning to the Combine system. Aishe recorded the numbers on Dika's manifest system. The names went into the consent document. The ones the staying chose to give, entered by their own hands or dictated through whatever bridge was available, in whatever language or symbol system they used. The woman, the organizer, the mapper, entered hers with the Combine stylus and characters Aishe didn't recognize, but which were written with the precision of someone accustomed to record keeping. On the evening of day 2, Aishe brought her to the bridge. Quintus was at the command station, reviewing the navigation corridor Pakla had plotted for the approach to the holding station. He looked up when they entered. His eyes moved from Aishe to the woman and stayed there for 3 seconds, the Roman assessment, reading, training, and discipline and utility in the set of someone's shoulders. Aishe said in the pigeon they had built together over 60 days, she managed. Before, in her world, records and territories, and the things an administration did not want to lose. A new thing Wododekis. Chunless looked at the woman for a moment longer. Then, in the dry and level voice that never carried emotion, even when emotion was the only thing moving behind his eyes, "What did you manage?" Aishe translated. The woman answered. Aishe translated back. Records, territory surveys, the tracking of things the administration wanted to not lose. Quintus's expression did not change, but something shifted in the set of his body, the same micro-adjustment Aishe had seen when Hattori first presented a strategic analysis that Quintus recognized as correct. The acknowledgement of competence. Good, Quintus said. We have things that should not be lost. The woman looked at the bridge, the navigation displays, the manifest system, the color-coded patrol charts, and Aishe saw her eyes do the thing that Aishe's eyes had done 60 days ago, the thing that marked their kind. She was already building the model, already mapping the system, already identifying what needed organizing and what was being lost and what could be preserved if someone with the right instincts took hold of it. Aishe watched her and thought, 41 new people, 3 departing for somewhere I cannot follow, 3 going back to the machine, 1 woman who will remember everything. The Arveth hummed around them. Somewhere oft, 40 new names were being entered into a document that had replaced a cargo manifest. Somewhere in the communication channels, Veth's network was receiving coordinates for destinations Aishe might never see. And somewhere ahead, 14 people sat in a box on a station 3 weeks away, and Pakla was already reading the space between here and there for the patterns the Combine was beginning to develop in response to a ship that kept appearing where ships like it should not be.